everyone, welcome back to the channel and Happy New Year to everyone. I can't believe it's finally 2021. So excited for this year, and hopefully it brings some happier news for everyone than last year did. Although here in the US, the first week has already been kind of crazy. So that's the thing. I'm sure everyone has seen the news, and yeah, I don't know. I mean, hopefully things will get better in a couple of weeks. But I'm not really sure. That wasn't really a very promising sign for what's to come in 21, but I still have hope that it's going to be a much better year than last year. So with that aside, I will just get right into this video. I'm super excited because I am finally doing the 4th installment of my Around the World in 80 Books series today. So that means we're basically caught up to videos of doing half of that because it's 80 books, and so this will be books 31 to 40. I've actually already read many of the books for the next set of 10, so that video may actually come a bit sooner and not have such a long gap between it as this one and the last one did. But also you never know, because I might just be reading other things in the middle, and this kind of takes a backseat for a while, which is totally fine. I'm not in any rush to finish this series. But yeah, I'm super excited to be talking about the next 10 books in this series. So as you know, the last video that I did in this series had a theme where I was reading books from countries that are along the equator, and this video also has a theme where I'm going to be talking about books that I read that are located kind of in the Middle East, Northern Africa region. It's a region of the world that I personally did not know a lot about and hadn't read many books from. Last year I read Celestial Bodies, which is by Joka Al-Harthi, who is an Omani author, and really found that interesting because I thought it was a great mix of learning more about the culture in that part of the world, learning more about the history of that part of the world, while also reading sort of a more dramatic family story. And that kind of got me thinking about parts of the world that I just personally don't have a ton of exposure to beyond like stuff you see on the news, which isn't a fair portrayal of any culture generally. So I thought it would be a great idea to intentionally focus on this part of the world and try to read books from countries that I normally wouldn't just kind of see in my everyday life, and sort of try to find those books and read them. So I read a selection of 10 books, all of which I found pretty awesome. Like, I don't think I disliked any of these books. So let's get right into it. Okay, so the first book that I have is from Lebanon, and this is The Prophet by Kahlil Gibran, which is a collection of poems by Kahlil Gibran, who is probably one of Lebanon's most famous authors when it comes to the international literary scene. This book kind of goes over poems in an interesting way. They're all kind of on specific topics, and they're written as like on love, on marriage, on children, blah, 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 like kind of going along on all these separate topics. I had heard that Kahlil Gibran is an amazing poet, and had gotten this book as a recommendation from so many people. It's pretty short. I read it in like a couple of hours, but I keep kind of coming back to many of these poems and thinking about them, so I found that aspect of it was really interesting. And he also does his own illustrations, so that part was really great as well. And there's actually one poem in here that I really enjoyed, which is on joy and sorrow. I really like this one. It kind of talks about how joy and sorrow are two sides of the same coin, and you can't really have one without the other. There's a great line in here that goes, "When you are joyous, look deep into your heart, and you shall find it is only that which has given you sorrow that is giving you joy. When you are sorrowful, look again in your heart, and you shall see that in truth you are weeping for that which has been your delight." And I just found this poem to be, talking about the balance of emotions and stuff like that. I thought that was a really interesting topic that kept coming up over and over again over the events of last year, and just kind of all the craziness that's been happening in everyone's lives. So I thought that felt very poignant. And so I really enjoyed this one. I think it's got a bunch of really interesting tidbits of wisdom in it, that it's a great book to just kind of have on your bookshelf and just pull out and like read one of those poems and kind of think and reflect on your own life a little bit. So really loved that aspect of it. So this was awesome. Okay, so book number 2 on the list is The Museum of Innocence by Orhan Pamuk. So Orhan Pamuk is a Nobel laureate for literature and is a Turkish author. So this book is set in 1970s Istanbul, and this book is just such a beautiful ode to the city of Istanbul, along with the story, of course, that's happening inside of it. I actually went on a trip to Turkey in 2019 and just fell in love with Istanbul. I think it's such a fascinating city that has been at the nexus of so many world events over the past like thousands of years, and kind of, you know, it's like a city split between Europe and Asia, and you can really see that come out from just the buildings that are there and the history that's taken place there. It's just a fascinating place full of so much culture and so much history, and I think Pamuk really does an amazing job bringing that to life. That being said, the story is kind of an interesting one. It's about a man who develops an illicit relationship with his much younger cousin, and he's kind of being torn apart by his love for her and infatuation for her, and the pressures that society and his family and kind of daily life have on him as sort of, a higher class individual in the 70s Istanbul. And so it's a really interesting exploration of his perspective and kind of as he goes through life, what that's like. I think the one thing I found a little weird about this book was, and this is something that generally bothers me about male authors writing about like romance or sex scenes, and that is, I always find that, I don't know if you guys have any suggestions on this, but I feel like I've never really found a male author who writes about like scenes dealing with intimacy in a way that doesn't leave me feeling uncomfortable, and I don't know if it's just something about the male gaze that like reading what a man is thinking, it's just weird. So I don't know, I found that remained a theme in this book as well, but it's something that has generally bothered me a lot about like any male authors. So I don't know if anyone has any suggestions for someone who's like done that well, but I thought that was one thing that was like kind of weird, but overall I found this book just to be such a fascinating exploration of just like the concept of love and in a city that I found to be so fascinating when I visited, even though 2019 Istanbul is way different from the 1970s Istanbul. But yeah, so love this one as well. So the third book that I have to talk about is Frankenstein in Baghdad by Ahmed Saadawi, who is an Iraqi author, and obviously this takes place in Baghdad, and draws on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as inspiration. And the basic premise of the story is that there is a junk dealer in Baghdad. This is post the US invasion of Baghdad, and there's been a bombing, and he's kind of picking up the pieces of bodies that have been strewn about, and he realizes that like none of these bodies are really treated with respect when they're buried, because it's like pieces of the bodies and they've kind of been desecrated in that sense. And so he takes all these pieces back home and stitches together a body that can be respectfully buried, except things do not go to plan, and this body comes to life and becomes a what's-its-name, or a Frankenstein. And basically this creature has now come to life with this righteous fury built up in him, and he basically starts going around Baghdad trying to kill all the criminals and punish them for what they've done, and sort of take revenge on all the people that are creating violence and causing issues in Baghdad, essentially. But it turns into a very interesting exploration of not only the traumas of war, but also the absurdity of war, and how this like endless revenge will just never end if people just don't put an end to it and decide to prioritize peace. Because there's an interesting line in it, which I'm now forgetting what the exact line is, but it basically talks about how no one is fully innocent and no one's fully a criminal, and when he punishes a criminal, that criminal also becomes a victim. So I thought it was a really interesting exploration of that idea, while also being super funny in many ways, and just, yeah, I thought it was fascinating, really well written, and I believe this book also won the International Prize for Arabic Fiction a few years ago, so it's definitely has won its accolades. And I should also mention that it is translated by Jonathan Wright to the English, so I read the English translation, of course. The next book is an audiobook that I listened to, which is Leap of Faith by Queen Noor Al-Hussein of Jordan. So Queen Noor has a very interesting story. She grew up in the US, and eventually met King Hussein of Jordan, and they had a big age gap between them, so she was quite young and he was much older when she married him. And then she basically kind of walks through the events of most of the late 20th century and what it was like being the wife of a monarch who was trying to navigate all of the history that was being made in this region and kind of what exactly was happening in the political landscape. And it is an interesting perspective, I thought, because she is not actually like the most active actor. Like, she's not involved in specific negotiations because she's not a head of state herself. And so she's kind of a passive actor or almost a spectator to many of these political events, but also has that insider's perspective on like what her husband was thinking and how King Hussein was approaching these decisions. And she was meeting all of these, presidents and leaders who were making all these decisions, and she was seeing on the ground how it was affecting people. So I thought that was an interesting perspective to have, and I appreciated reading about her life. I didn't know anything about her, honestly, before picking up this book, but I found that to be a very fascinating look at a perspective that you don't always see when thinking about like conflict in the world and stuff like that. So the next book that I have to talk about is from Israel, and that is Hollow Land by Eyal Weizman. I think this book is a bit controversial, but Weizman is an Israeli architect, and he basically talks about the concept of using architecture in a weaponized manner to aid Israel in the Palestinian occupation. Obviously, you can see why this book is controversial, because the Israel-Palestine just conflict as a whole is a very controversial issue. I appreciated it in the history that it kind of presented and how it talked about how architecture has been used by the Israeli government in its attempt to occupy Palestinian territories. I don't actually know a ton about this conflict, and I should do more research about it because it is, obviously a big conflict in the world today. But I really thought it was like an interesting perspective on something that, like architecture and like buildings, you don't think about that as like a means that people could weaponize in a sense. And so I thought that perspective on it was interesting, and just kind of how he approaches it as an architect, to be thinking about these things that you wouldn't normally think about. So I really appreciated that. Thought it was a fascinating read. Thought it kind of made me think about things in a way that I hadn't before, and has also sparked my interest in definitely just, it feels like a responsibility for me as just like a global citizen to know more about this issue and about how it affects people in reality, because it has been a devastating issue for so many people for so many years. So definitely not an easy read, but I think an important one for people to pick up. So the next book that I have is Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi, and this is from Iran. So this is a pretty famous book. I think many people have probably read this, but it's actually a kind of graphic novel, and I think it started off as a comic strip that she wrote, and illustrated, of course, and it's basically just a memoir, but in the form of a graphic novel. And it talks about how, as a young girl, she went through the Iranian Revolution, and then just kind of her journey in life and going to Europe as an Iranian woman and what that was like, and how her parents dealt with, being persecuted by the Iranian government, and things like that. And so it's a really interesting look at, as a young girl, how she was understanding what was happening around her and just learning about the history of what happened in Iran, which, again, I didn't know too much about before picking this up. So I thought that this was a really important perspective to hear about what was happening, and just the fact that it was made as a graphic novel just made it really easy to relate to and engage with all of the people in her life and her herself. So I thought that it was just a wonderful way to present this story, and it is a beautiful and heart-wrenching story in many ways. So I'd highly recommend this one as well. Okay, the next book that I read was The Other Americans by Laila Lalami from Morocco. And this actually is about Moroccan immigrants to the United States and a Moroccan immigrant family living in California. So it kind of starts out as like a mystery. And basically what has happened is the main character, Nora, or one of the main characters, Nora, her father, Driss, has basically been killed in a hit-and-run car accident, and she's trying to find out who did it, and her family's trying to find out who did it. So it's kind of like a police procedural whodunit type of thing, but it quickly kind of extrapolates to something much bigger than that, and Laila Lalami takes this, this story, this mystery, and kind of makes it an interrogation of what it's like to be an immigrant in parts of America that are not welcoming to immigrants. And it's a really interesting and nuanced look at that particular experience, and one that I actually, personally have not had to deal with as much. I feel like I've been fairly lucky in living in quite progressive communities growing up, and communities that have a ton of diversity in them, so there's not a lot of like racism that has happened to me personally in my life, because I've been fortunate enough to be surrounded by a lot of people who have worldly perspectives and are appreciative of the benefits of diversity, but there are so many parts of this country where that's not the case, and it's so hard to be an immigrant and someone who has a different skin tone. And so I think that interrogation was done just really, really well. And it's interesting. I thought one aspect of it that was really interesting was how it's written from multiple perspectives, and there's multiple characters that kind of take over narrating the book. And she changes her writing style with each character's perspective, which I thought was really cool and kind of makes it easy to follow along with like who's talking, because you can just sort of tell based on how the writing is flowing who the character is that's narrating that section. So I thought that was like an interesting literary aspect of the book as well, but just a fascinating book. Made me cry multiple times, so I would highly recommend. So the next one we have is from Libya, and that is The Return by Hisham Matar. I have this giant sticker on here that I'm worried about taking off because I feel like it's going to peel off part of the cover, but that's irritating, but it's there because I bought this on sale. But anyway, this book is basically a memoir written by Hisham Matar, and he is basically a Libyan man who now lives, I believe, in New York, but has also lived in the UK. And essentially, his father was a dissident against Gaddafi's regime. And after the fall of Gaddafi, the book kind of talks about him going back to Libya in search of his father, who's been thrown in prison, and his family has basically not heard from him since then. And he's heard like bits and pieces from some people who claim to have seen him, but from afar, so they're not really sure. And he's kind of holding on to hope that his father has somehow survived the horrific conditions of the prison that he was put in, and that he will somehow be able to find him. And it's sort of an exploration of both his memories from the past and sort of what happened as Gaddafi came to power, but also in the present day as he's trying to search for his father and trying to find at least closure, if not actually find him alive somewhere. So I thought it was just a very poignant book, and Hisham Matar is actually a novelist, I believe, and so this is like his memoir, but he's also written several novels, so he has a really great way of just sort of encapsulating feelings and emotions into words, and I thought it was just such a wonderful book thinking about the relationship of a father and his son. So great one as well. The next book is from Egypt, and it is The Yacoubian Building by Alaa al-Aswany, translated by Humphrey Davies. So this is basically a novel that is set around a building, which actually exists in Cairo, called the Yacoubian Building. And it's told from the perspectives of many different characters who are all somehow connected to this building. Many of the characters actually live in the building or work in the building. And they come from all different strata of sort of social life. So there's like, from the doorkeeper's son to the poorest residents who kind of live on the roof to some of the wealthier people who have offices in the building, all the way to the top of the political elite who are just sort of using the building as like a hiding space. And it's a really fascinating look at different parts of Egyptian social structure and kind of how that operated under the Mubarak regime when that was a thing. So this takes place a bit in the past from today, obviously. I think this published first in 2002, and then the English translation came out in 2004. So it's pretty old of a novel, but still contemporary, I would say. I think one thing in particular that struck me as particularly fascinating was his treatment of the characters who are LGBTQ in this book and how nuanced that treatment of them was, which I really, appreciated and thought was very interesting and not something I was expecting when I first picked up the book, so that was great. And this is just it was a very fast-paced, fun book to read, but also dealt with a lot of deeper issues that happen in Cairo, and talked a lot about the history of kind of Egyptian society and what it was like under the Mubarak regime. So, great book as well, great historical fiction. And the last book that I have to talk about today, I know this video's already gone kind of long, is The Land of Invisible Women, A Female Doctor's Journey in the Saudi Kingdom by Qanta Ahmed. Now, I will say that I know this book is not written by a Saudi person, so that was a decision I made in my project to count this as a Saudi book, but I thought the reason that this made sense to count as a Saudi book is Qanta Ahmed basically is a doctor. She's, I think, British Pakistani, but was living in New York, and she gets an offer to go and work in Saudi Arabia as a doctor for a year because her visa's expiring in the US. And so she takes up the opportunity and decides to go do it without knowing too much about what she's getting herself into. And then it kind of chronicles her experiences while she's there. And I thought what's really interesting is, of course, she talks about her own experiences, kind of coming to terms with her spirituality and her religion, coming to terms with the sacrifices she has to make to be an effective doctor in the Saudi kingdom, and what it's like to be a female doctor who has come from abroad, and just sort of how jarring that transition can be to Saudi society. But I think what's also cool is she takes the experiences of the women around her and talks about them as well. And she provides a nuanced perspective that talks about women who have very different perspectives. Some of them really embrace their religion. Some of them do not embrace their religion. Some of them really embrace some of the Wahhabi ideals that are part of Saudi society. Some of them want to escape and go abroad as soon as they can. Some of them have loving relationships with their families and their husbands and their children. Some of them feel like they've been pigeonholed and forced into things. So it just kind of, provides this perspective on the diversity of what Saudi women are like, which is something that you don't normally get to see, and something that she was specifically able to learn about as a woman herself, because those women felt comfortable sharing their stories with her. So I thought this was a very fascinating look at Saudi life in general, and specifically what it's like to be a woman in Saudi Arabia, and the diversity of experiences that are encapsulated in the Saudi Arabian woman, who's not just one stereotype that you can assign to that identity, which is very multifaceted, just like any other identity. So yeah, that is all the books that I have for you guys today. This is, again, the 4th installment of my Around the World in 80 Books series. Super excited to bring you guys the next one. So yeah, stay tuned as always for the next video. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. I will be back to see you guys soon. Have a great 2021. Can't wait to share more videos with y'all. So I'll see you around next time. Bye-bye.